From TransportTopics in Washington, D.C., this is RoadSigns. Here is your host, Seth Clevenger.
Thank you for listening to RoadSigns, the podcast series from TransportTopics that explores the trends and technologies that are shaping the future of trucking. Over the next 2 episodes, we're going to review some of our most compelling conversations with previous guests. These first 2 entries in our new Roundabout series start with one of the most fascinating technology trends in our industry, the advance of automated driving and driver assist technology in commercial trucking. In part 1, we're going to revisit past interviews with CEOs who are leading a pair of automated truck startups. One has been testing and developing highly automated trucks, while the other is building truck platooning technology. Later in the program, we're going to return to our September 2019 interview with Chetan Marichli, co-founder and CEO of platooning developer Locomation. But first, we're going to go all the way back to the debut episode of RoadSigns in June of 2018 and my conversation with Alex Rodriguez, CEO of self-driving truck developer Embark. Let's play that interview now. Alex Rodriguez is the CEO of Embark, a San Francisco-based startup that is developing self-driving truck technology and is testing it out on the road today. So thank you very much for joining us, Alex.
Thanks for having me, Seth.
You bet. Embark has been actively testing and operating self-driving trucks mostly in the southwestern U.S. on Interstate 10. Today, these trucks have a safety driver behind the wheel as a backup, ready to take over when needed. But the goal is to eventually reach the point where your trucks can operate on the freeway without a driver on board.
Mm-hmm.
So just how much work remains before you can confidently pull this safety driver out of the truck and secure approval from regulators to do so? And describe the path you'll need to take to get to that point.
Yeah, so Seth, this ends up being, this obviously is the million-dollar question of this whole thing. And we're trying to make sure that we're doing it in a smooth, responsible cadence, I guess is sort of the key here. What are the pieces that need to go into it? First off, you need to do a whole lot of reliability testing. So going back and forth on I-10, initially, this isn't going to be a United States-wide thing. Initially, this is going to be a single route in the southwestern United States, as you mentioned. And so we end up having to have a bunch of trucks out testing with safety drivers to get to a point where we can show that they're reliable enough that they can safely do the whole driving task. And we think that that's probably going to take a couple of years just to do that initial testing just for that first route. In terms of what other pieces we have to do, we obviously also have to work with the regulators and with the OEMs, and both of those are sort of ongoing. The regulatory landscape is not set in stone yet, but we spend a lot of time making sure that we work very closely with the regulators. They know what we're doing, and that they're doing things at a reasonable pace, right? It would be bad. Just like it would be bad if the regulations were late and you couldn't deploy, even though it was safe, it would be bad if the regulations were early and we wrote the regulations around technology that hadn't been fully proven out yet. So we're working closely with them to make sure that the regulations line up with the technology and they end up coming out on the same timeline.
Absolutely. That's very good guidance. And to be clear, I mean, you're talking millions of miles of testing, right? I mean, this is not something that happens overnight. This is lots of testing, extensive on-road testing to get to that point.
Yeah, that's right. We're talking doing probably more miles of testing than any individual human driver will drive in a career.
Sure. Now, let's go ahead and talk about Embark's deployment model for autonomous trucks. So, to be clear, you're designing and programming these self-driving trucks to operate only on freeways, which means that these trucks will need to hand off trailers to conventional trucks piloted by drivers for the remaining short haul into the city or on local routes to a distribution center. And these freight handoffs between autonomous and conventional trucks would take place at transfer hubs that would be built at key points along interstates. So Alex, could you tell us a little bit more about this transfer hub concept and why you see this as the best way to deploy autonomous trucks in the relative near term?
Yeah, so the way that we see the deployment of driverless trucks, you have to be thinking not just about what's technically feasible, but about what fits with the industry. And so there's been a lot of noise about a competing concept where you would have the driver stay in the truck. But we think that while it's technically achievable, it doesn't do anything for the big problems facing the industry today. So obviously those are the driver shortage, those are in particular the shortage in long haul driving. And so we think that if you have to have a driver still inside the vehicle, what you end up doing is creating a new class of driving, which in my opinion, I imagine in most people's opinion, is even harder than 11 hours and then sleeping, and then 11 hours and then sleeping, where this new class of driving would have to be, you're just sitting in the back of a truck for a long period of time, occasionally getting called upon to support it, potentially driving or potentially on call for many more than the current 14 hours, but still away from home, all those problems. So you could build the tech, sure, but it wouldn't do anything to make a driver's life better or to make driving jobs more desirable. And so it's not really helping solve any of the problems facing the industry today. By taking the transfer hub model, what we're doing is breaking the route up so that you have what used to be one big long haul route becomes two local routes with an autonomous section in the middle. And this actually is both technically feasible and now starts to address the driver shortage, where you've gone from a long haul route, which could have been one of the 50,000 that we don't have a driver to fill today. And we've actually created new local jobs, which are much easier to fill and much more desirable. And we're getting the same freight moved. And so that's a big part of the reason why we think you want to go with the transfer hubs model. Yes, there are other ways to do it from a technical perspective, but once you start thinking about how does this fit with the needs of the industry, how does this fit with the needs of the drivers, it makes a lot more sense to try and allow drivers to stay local in their own city.
Sure. As you said, the driver is the real constraint that the industry is facing right now. So this concept of transfer hubs is really aimed at finding a way to make that work for the driver and make the job better for the driver. And just looking at the technology side of this, by restricting the scope of operations to the freeways, you can introduce autonomous trucks much sooner, right? It'll take a lot longer to develop autonomous trucks that can go, in theory, anywhere that a truck today can go with a driver, right?
Yes. It will take a lot longer because it's much, much harder to do from a technical perspective to drive in the city. And also, it's much harder from a logistical perspective. There's a lot of interaction with the end customer, pre-trip, post-trip inspection, bills of lading, maybe loading in certain locations. There's a lot of detail at the beginning and the end of a trip that is really best suited to a person, along with it being a much harder driving job. Whereas once you get out onto the interstate, there's a lot less things that are going on.
10 everyday uses of TransportTopics on Alexa. 1. While you get ready for work in the morning. 2. While you cook breakfast. 3. While you eat breakfast. 4. While you drive to work. 5. While you're at work. 6. While you eat your lunch. 7. While you're driving home. 8. While you cook dinner. 9. While you eat dinner. 10. Well, let's face it, it's 1 minute with today's biggest industry headlines. The listening options are endless, so why be confined to 10? Simply say, "Okay, Google, talk to TransportTopics."
When we think about autonomy, when we think about automation in this industry, there's always the question of what will the emergence of autonomous trucks mean for truck driving jobs in the years ahead? So what are your thoughts, Alex? How will this job change? And what would you say to somebody who's concerned that the truck driving job might just disappear altogether?
Yeah. So I guess I would say a couple different things. The first one is don't believe the hype. The media loves sensationalist stories about how there will be no driving jobs in 2 years from now, which is just not in line with the reality of the technical development. This is a gigantic industry with a huge variety of different driving tasks, which are each individually very hard, and all of which are going to take a bunch of time to do. And so I don't see, for example, city driving or even driving in snowy northern areas happening anytime in the next decade. So the first thing I think to say is don't believe the hype. The media has their reasons for trying to make things overblown, but it's just not realistic. The second thing that I would say is that there are a lot of, as I said before, parts of the driving task that I think are not well suited to automation, that are much better done by a person. And I don't think that's going to change anytime in the near future. So although we might see automation in chunks of the job that make sense, like driving long interstate stretches on good quality roads, there are whole big chunks of the industry that you're unlikely to ever get to. For example, I don't think we'll ever do hazmat. I don't think that we're ever going to be doing like last mile drop off or pickup for the vast majority of situations. And so that's sort of the second piece is, one, don't believe the hype. It's going to be a lot slower than people say. Two, it's not going to be everything. It's going to be sort of piecemeal, bit by bit, and it's not going to cover the whole industry. And so I think that means that when you account for the big shortage that currently exists and for the huge amount of turnover that already exists in trucking, that pretty much anybody who is presently in the industry and wants to continue in the industry is going to be able to find a job. And then the third thing I would say is that we really don't know the answer. So it's going to be slower. It's going to be less absolute. And also that it's hard to predict the deployment of technologies. And so I think it's possible that the total number of drivers decreases as a result of automation 15, 20 years from now. It's also possible that it doesn't. Because, for example, right now we have 50,000 routes that are unfilled. If we fill those in part using automation and in part using local drivers, we actually have more driving jobs than we had before. And so there are a bunch of different variables, and I don't pretend to know exactly how it's going to play out, but I think it's going to play out in a slower, smoother way than the hype would have you believe.
Okay, yeah, that's very helpful. That perspective on what we're really looking at, in the years and decades ahead. And we often think about the potential for autonomous trucks to improve safety. We maybe even think about the potential to reduce labor costs at some point in the future. But let's also take a moment to consider the potential for autonomy to improve productivity in the industry. So earlier this year, an Embark truck completed a coast-to-coast test run along the length of I-10 from LA to Jacksonville, Florida. And there was a safety driver behind the wheel who was, of course, still beholden to hours of service limits. So this run took the normal 5 days. But in theory, if you reach the point where you can remove the driver and the truck can operate around the clock or close to it, suddenly that journey can be completed in 2 days instead of 5. So what are your thoughts on just how that could transform the supply chain someday?
Yeah, I think this is one of the gigantic pieces of automation that a lot of people don't talk about or don't consider. If you allow a vehicle to operate 24/7, you completely change how supply chains need to be set up, right? We're talking about the time to get things from any place to any other place that's more than 11 hours away suddenly dropping in half. We're talking about being able to achieve, like when you say here 2 days instead of 5, like for context, that's now going, like we're now talking closer to air freight speeds than what it presently takes a truck to cross the country. And so that's radical. Again, I was talking about earlier, what are ways this is going to change the industry? One of the things we might not predict, maybe a lot of air freight switches to trucks. And that actually increases demand. Anyway, you're going to change the speed of things, and you're also going to change the layout of distribution centers, right? Today, the major LTL networks are all set up so that their DCs are all 11 hours apart, so that you can drive from one, switch in the middle, and then drive back. And obviously, if you can go 24/7, that completely changes how you set up warehouses. So you're going to see things moving a lot faster. You're going to see things like Amazon shipping becoming cheaper and being able to get 1-day shipping instead of 2-day shipping, or 2-day shipping instead of 1-week shipping. And we're talking about being able to radically improve the efficiency of warehouses, supply chains, and just-in-time manufacturing.
All right, well, this will all be fascinating to watch moving forward, that's for sure. We certainly live in a very interesting time for the transportation industry. It's a fun time to be in this industry, and for me to write about it and report about it. And thanks again, Alex, for participating in the podcast. It was great to chat with you.
Thanks for having me, Seth. Cheers.
Transport topics in one word: authoritative.
Knowledge. Outstanding. Reliable.
We asked Transport Topics readers to describe us in one word.
Informative.
Informative.
Integrity.
The Bible. Authoritative.
The authority.
Transportation information, that's 2, but I gotta have it both.
Physically large. Oh, that's 2 words.
Visit influence.ttnews.com/say hello to find out what they're talking about.
Next on Road Signs, we're excited to welcome Chetan Marichley, co-founder and CEO of Locomation, a Pittsburgh-based startup company that is developing truck platooning technology. Thanks for joining us, Chetan.
Thanks for having me, Seth. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So the concept of truck platooning, where 2 or more trucks connect wirelessly to form a convoy, has been a topic of discussion in the trucking industry for quite a while now. But Locomation is really taking, a very interesting approach to this technology. So in a nutshell, your company is developing a 2-truck platooning system where the follower truck can drive itself with no input. And that means the driver in that truck can actually step away from driving and even go off duty. But of course, you can explain this a lot better than me, Chetan. So, how does your system work?
Well, you actually explained it quite well, but let me elaborate a little bit and give an example. Assume that we have 2 trucks, as you said, and we have 2 drivers. The drivers drive the trucks completely manually, just like they do today, to get through the urban areas, to get through the congested traffics, etc., up until they are on the freeway. Once they are on the freeway, they engage our system. Assume that there's a big green button and you press the button, and now the 2 trucks form a convoy. Once the system is engaged, the driver in the front truck remains in control. In fact, assumes the control of the entire convoy. And the driver in the follower truck now can leave the driver's seat and go off duty and go rest, sleep, read a book, or browse the internet. And at that point, the follower truck turns into a proper, fully autonomous truck with the only job of knowing where the lead truck is and be able to follow the lead truck.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting approach to this. And, when you think about this, while that system's engaged, the driver of that lead truck is effectively driving both vehicles at the same time on the highway, while that other driver in the rear vehicle is resting. So you can really think of this as an advanced form of team driving, but with 2 vehicles. So how would a team driving concept work with this platooning system?
That's a perfect analogy to our system. It's exactly like traditional team driving, where you have two drivers taking turns driving the same truck. In our system, that you still have 2 drivers taking turn driving a convoy of 2 trucks. So you are doing the traditional team driving with an extra truckload of freight that comes with you. On top of that, in traditional team driving, 2 drivers have to stay in the same cab and share the same personal space. In our version, the drivers get their own cabs. So while benefiting from the perks of team driving, they also can have their own personal spaces and have a little bit more comfortable driving experience.
And of course, you have a huge, productivity gain from multiple vehicles instead of 1. And that's where I want to kind of take the conversation next. When we think about the business case for platooning, much of the early conversation about this in the industry has really focused on fuel economy improvements. Because you have a shorter following distance, it's more aerodynamic, you can save fuel. But with Locomation, we really are looking at that potential for some very significant gains in fleet productivity and driver productivity. And would you say, that productivity gain is actually the primary return on investment for a platooning system like the one you're working on?
Absolutely. In fact, if we list 3 pillars of value proposition brought by our system. First and foremost is the improved asset utilization and driver utilization. That's definitely number 1. The second one is improved safety through assistance of the autonomy. And the third one is, of course, the fuel savings. We cannot overlook the fuel savings. There are some significant numbers there, but when you look at the bottom line and look at the dollar values, the benefits or the savings coming from improved asset utilization and improved driver time actually is about a magnitude higher than what you would gain from the fuel efficiency.
Sure. And can you quantify at all what types of productivity gain you might see? If a carrier is able to roll the system out, just how much better in terms of utilization and of both the equipment and driver time do you really see here?
So when you look at the industry norms today, the average utilization time per day is about 7.5 hours. And with our system, in an ideal case, we would like to be able to push it up to 10.5 hours per driver shift, which is actually the physical limit what a driver can do. And on a per truck basis, we would like to see numbers close to 22 hours a day or even 23 hours a day, except for some very light pre-trip, post-trip inspections and some refueling activities. Of course, the actual realizations will depend on the actual routes and the actual scheduling system per fleet, but the theoretical gains are there.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. But I mean, when you think about how you could really potentially reap the productivity benefits of a system like this, there's also an important question to answer from a regulatory standpoint. And that really deals with hours of service. If the driver of the following truck is resting in the sleeper berth, will that driver be considered off duty, or will that still count toward driving time under hours of service rules? It really is, I think, a central question, and I want to understand Locomation's approach to that question and how will the regulations need to change to take full advantage of a platooning system like this?
For that particular hours of service concern that you brought up, the regulation is already there. In fact, there is a very recent ruling declaring the sleeper berth time non-compensable. So the drivers cruising in a moving truck, but in the sleeper berth and not actively driving, are already considered off duty. Having said that, most fleets honor the time spent in the cab and end up paying the driver a fraction of what a full-time driving activity would pay. But in our case, when you look at the overall labor efficiency point of view, now we are bundling two trucks together, and in the team driving scenario, that normally would require 4 drivers to take 2 trucks to, say, 1,000-mile route. And in our case, you only need 2 drivers to take 2 trucks. So you actually have the luxury to compensate the resting driver a little bit better than the industry standard today, while still seeing huge improvements in your bottom line. To shortly answer your question, again, to wrap up, the regulations of hours of service for that particular matter is already in place. There are a couple of other flexibilities required in the hours of service, such as we would like to have the drivers be able to spend the first half an hour or 45 minutes driving through the urban miles, but then be able to take a 5-6 hour rest and then assume driving. That requires some modifications in the current FMCSA rules, and FMCSA is already moving towards that direction, and we have active conversations with them.
I see. Okay. It's a really interesting aspect of this, of course, because these rules and regulations were not written with platooning in mind. So it's a new technology, and there are certainly some finer points of a regulation like hours of service that do need to be looked at. And it's good to hear that those conversations are ongoing.
Of course, when you look at the current hours of service regulations, it's all written in the pen and paper era, without the digitalization, without any kind of data stream from the trucks. And truck driving is a very serious, very critical job that we need to make sure that everybody is safe all the time. So now, with the advances in the technology, the incoming data streams through the electronic logging devices, and with the advances in the new technologies like what Locomation is developing, now we have actually quantifiable hard evidence that we can present to the regulators and ask for some flexibilities. So we will see that gaining more momentum as we go forward.
Now, for Locomation's initial platooning system, there will still be a driver in the follower truck. Even if that driver is off duty, there's still a person in the vehicle, even if they're not actively driving. But when you look ahead, do you anticipate someday reaching a point where that follower truck is really becomes an unmanned drone truck, and you have a driver still in the lead vehicle but not the rear vehicle? And can the platoon expand from 2 to 3 or even more trucks? Understand that we may be getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, but what do you see as the path forward for platooning technology in the years ahead?
That's an excellent question and a very on point observation. That's indeed on our roadmap. We are starting initially with 2 trucks and 2 driver convoys, but as we move forward, one of the first things that will happen is on select routes where the nature of the route itself permits, we will see a 2 truck, single driver convoys for certain segments. And then we will expand the length of the convoy from 2 trucks to 3 trucks to be able to schedule more across the industry and have mixed and matched convoys going to the same direction with only some of the trucks will have some human drivers. Maybe just 1 driver as the lead in the lead position, or maybe 2 drivers, but 3 trucks, the 3rd truck being a drone follower.
And I also want to circle back to the question of fuel efficiency gains that I mentioned earlier. And, as I mentioned, a lot of the early conversation about platooning has centered on saving fuel, with some estimating in the range of 10% savings for the rear truck. But actually, at the beginning of this year, Martin Dahm, who's the head of Daimler's global truck division, did cast some doubt on the real-world fuel economy gains that you can really achieve based on their testing. So, Chetan, I want to get your take on what's really achievable in terms of fuel economy gains from platooning.
We believe with Locomation's approach of fully autonomous followers, we are able to get the gap distance, the separation distance between 2 trucks to a very narrow separation, and hence really discourage or maybe even make impossible to cut in. And what Daimler was citing was the cut-ins resulting the follower truck to first slow down and then have to reaccelerate to catch with the convoy, and that reacceleration erasing most of the fuel gains from platooning. In Locomation's approach, we don't have to slow down and accelerate. Instead, we can maintain a very smooth cruising all over the platooning segment. And according to our projections, we'll be able to get the estimated fuel savings with our system.
Okay, and what would be a typical following distance with your system? And would you be able to project a rough fuel economy savings percentage, understanding that there's a lot of variables in that?
There really is, but we are aiming to hit 7 or 8 meters separation distance at highway speeds when we go fully commercial. Of course, in the initial testing scenarios, we will start with larger gap distances and over time make it smaller. But for the commercial deployment scenario, we are shooting for 7 or 8 meters, or roughly 20 feet separation distance. And at those distances, we should be able to see on average 8% per truck fuel savings, which when you decompose it, it's about 5 to 6% for the lead truck and about 10 to 12% for the follower truck.
Now, before we continue, I do want to rewind a little bit and talk a little bit about your background and also how you started Locomation. So, Chetan, take us back to the beginning. What really sparked your interest in truck platooning, and why did you decide to start this company, and how did it all come together?
My fascination with AI and robotics started about 20 years ago. And since then, I devoted my career in understanding how to make mobile robots, more intelligent and more useful. And I've always been fascinated with the systems engineering aspect of it, building entire systems to address real-world problems. About 10 years ago, I joined Carnegie Mellon University, and I spent a good part of the last decade at National Robotics Engineering Center, which is the applied R&D branch of Robotics Institute of Carnegie Mellon, where I met most of my co-founders there, and we've spent a lot of time collectively over 100 years working on autonomous vehicles. In fact, we've even built military truck convoys in the past. And being around heavy machinery all these times, we've always kept an eye on the trucking and transportation, and we've always felt that trucking actually has the biggest potential for the prime first application of autonomy at commercial scale. So about 2 years ago, we decided to take all of our expertise and know-how and apply it to a very well-defined commercial problem that we believe we can actually build a product in a short time frame and use that product to reach higher levels of benefits later on. That's how we decided to start Locomission, and that's how we decided to focus on trucking and truck convoying as the very first step.
Well, thanks for that. And speaking of this pathway to truck platooning, where does Locomission stand today on its path toward launching a commercial product? Tell us a little bit about the technical trials and on-road testing that you're working on right now.
Yeah, we have been quietly working very diligently on our technology, and we started testing our trucks in closed test tracks a couple of months ago. And right now we are in the process of doing the final integration and final shakeout tests. Later in September, around end of September, we will actually start doing some public road tests. We have a signed trial agreement with a top carrier that we will announce separately. So we will start pulling commercial loads as part of their operations somewhere in Southwest as early as end of September, early October timeframe.
All right. Well, we'll certainly watch for that. That'll be very interesting to learn more about as that comes to fruition. And you kind of looking ahead, how soon might we see a broad commercial launch of this platooning system? Not just trials, but reaching a point where a fleet can actually go order and install your technology and deploy your technology.
We are aiming to start shipping the very first commercial units sometime in the calendar year of 2021.
Okay.
So it's really around the corner.
And how will you take this technology to market? Do you envision this as something that will have to be factory installed by the truck manufacturers, or will there be an aftermarket opportunity, at least in the beginning? What is your strategy for going to market?
So there are really two lanes of development there. In one lane, of course, eventually in some point in the future, this technology will be blended in the OEM and Tier 1 supplied technologies. But that's a longer play. In the short term, we want it to be really on the market as soon as possible and with as wide of an audience as possible. So we are developing our system as an aftermarket retrofit kit that can be bolted on customer trucks. And we envision that from this initial aftermarket kit design, we will have a gradual path towards deeper and deeper integration with the existing OEM and Tier 1 designs. But initially, we are going to be an aftermarket retrofit kit.
Okay. Finally, before I let you go, I also want to ask you to look ahead and share your thoughts on how trucking might be different, say, 10 years from now. Some of the big trends we see today are, of course, automated driving. You can think of platooning as part of that. Also a move toward the first introduction of electric trucks. And, of course, we've seen connected vehicles be a broad trend for some time now. But how much of that do you think will be a reality a decade from now?
I think we will see bits and pieces of all. So we will definitely see some early generation electric trucks in the short haul parts or the last mile or last couple of tens of miles delivery part. We will definitely see a lot more connected vehicles with different levels of automation. And we will definitely see some automated driving. I believe in the next decade, we will start seeing some fully driverless trucks on select routes, but I don't think it's going to be a blanket solution, and we will not have every single semi-truck driving itself with no human present on the cab in the next decade. So there will be progress all over, but we are not going to hit the eventual very, very long-term goals in the next 10 years.
All this stuff takes time, of course.
It takes time.
Usually it's more of an evolution than a revolution, but we are on the cusp of a lot of very interesting developments in trucking, to say the least.
Absolutely. And evolution is not a very bad thing as long as you can be cognizant and resourceful about embracing the evolution and make sure that you are getting the best commercial benefits out of what is possible and available today, rather than just waiting for a multi-decade research experiment to pan out.
This has really been a fascinating conversation, but I think we've reached a pretty good stopping point here. So just want to say thanks again for joining us, Chetan, and sharing all your thoughts and all the very interesting stuff that you're working on at Locomission.
It's been a delight and great pleasure. Thanks so much again for having me, Seth.
From time to time, an issue commands so much of the industry's attention that it requires a deeper dive, a resource readers can turn to. a Transport Topics special report. In 2019, we produced two. One, on the rising tide of electric trucks that are promising to reshape how goods are moved down the road. We also examined trends in trucking and insurance, with particular focus on how new technologies help motor carriers eliminate risk and how this is influencing insurers' underwriting practices. I'm Joe Howard, Executive Editor here at Transport Topics, and I invite you to learn more about our special reports and reserve your copy of the next one at ttn.ws/special.
The advance of automated driving technology is raising a lot of exciting possibilities for enhancing safety and efficiency in the trucking industry. But this technology is taking many different forms. First off, automation will further improve the active safety systems that are already supporting many truck drivers as they deliver the nation's freight. At the same time, companies such as Embark are testing highly automated trucks designed to operate in hub-to-hub operations. And others, like Locomation, are developing truck platooning technology that could enhance driver productivity. These startup companies are emblematic of an influx of new talent and venture capital targeting the trucking industry. We'll continue this conversation soon in part 2 of our RoadSigns Roundabout series on automated trucks. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please let others know. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If my questions have sparked questions of your own, share them with me and the RoadSigns team. You can email us at share@ttnews.com. We'll read them and respond daily. Until next time, I'm Seth Clevenger. Thank you for listening.